Good evening, everyone. My name is Kathleen McDonald, and I'm the Executive Director at the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian up in Evanston. I am delighted to be welcoming you to tonight's program, Indigenous Science, Ethnobotany, and Conservation Practices. I'd like to begin by recognizing the indigenous people who were first stewards of this land, the Council of Three Fires tribes, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe, and all the tribes who lived and traveled here before and after. As many groups throughout the state of Illinois are celebrating the 200th anniversary of Illinois statehood, we are glad to present a program based not on the settlers, but the first people of this land, the first and continuing caretakers. Indigenous Science is presented to you by the Chicago Council of Science and Technology, Chicago City Markets, and Trickster Gallery, with generous help from the Mitchell Museum of American Indian and the Cultural Alliance and Northern Illinois University and University of Chicago's Society of Advancement for Chicanos and Native Americans in Science chapters. About the program organizers this evening, if you are new to the Chicago Council on Science and Technology, C2S2, it is an 11-year-old not-for-profit organization that seeks to enhance the public's understanding and appreciation of science and technology and their impact on society. C2S2 hosts about 30 free and low-cost programs throughout the year on any and all science and technology topics. Tonight, you can help C2ST champion the wealth of science and tech in our community and elevate Chicago as the science city by making a $10 donation. Your support is vital to their programming efforts and allows us to bring you new programming throughout the year. Please visit c2st.org or refer to the postcards on the sign-in table for C2S2's upcoming programs. You can also sign up on their mailing list and get reminders about the program in your email. We also want to tell you a little bit about some of the other organizing partners. The Trickster Art Gallery with CEO Joe Podlasek and their board of directors, staff, and volunteers. They run the only Native-owned and operated art institution in the state of Illinois. The Trickster has 10,000 square feet of space used for Native and multicultural programming with 55-car free parking for year-round. Highlights of their national programs are their Native Veterans Program and 3 rotating art gallery spaces with 3,000 square feet of educational gallery with hands-on and expanding designs. You can find out more about them at trickstergallery.com. They'll be closing out the month with 4 amazing artists from across the country that are opening a program November 30th at 6 p.m. called Native American Body of Art. We'd also like to thank Peter Vargas from the Chicago Cultural Alliance and the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian for recommending our speakers. The CCA is an active consortium of 40 Chicago area cultural heritage museums, centers, and historical societies who span 28 neighborhoods and 7 suburbs in the Chicago area, representing over 30 different cultures from around the world. CCA helps to connect, promote, and support centers of cultural heritage for a more inclusive Chicago. The Mitchell Museum of the American Indian is one of a handful of museums across the country that focus exclusively on the art, history, culture, and current events of Native American peoples from throughout the US and Canada. This weekend, the museum is hosting the Native American Fine Arts Holiday Market with a preview party Friday evening from 6:30 to 8:30. And the market is open Saturday from 10 to 5 and Sunday noon to 4, with artist demonstrations both afternoons. More information can be found at mitchellmuseum.org. With the program, we also are proud partners with the City of Chicago's Chicago Department of Cultural Affairs, the commissioners and their staff members, specifically Ron Salazar and Elisa Baum, who made the beautiful space available, this lovely room at the Chicago Cultural Center. We are excited that you have joined us to learn more about science side of Indigenous cultures. I'd now like to tell you a few housekeeping things. First of all, the bathrooms are down the hall to the right. We will be having a Q&A period, and we ask that you respect the hearing impaired and wait for a microphone when you want to ask questions. We do ask that you turn down your cell phones, but encourage you to take pictures and post and live tweet throughout the event. Please use the conference app by typing c2st.cnf.io. You can sign into that link on your phone browser. You can ask questions anonymously throughout the talk and evaluate the program at the end. The program is also being recorded by CAN TV. You can see any part of the talk again and share with your friends on C2S2 TV and CAN TV YouTube channels. Now it is my great privilege to introduce our speakers for this evening. Adam Kessel is Lakota Italian and has extensive experience as a teacher in environmental education. His book, which is on the desk out front, called Zombie Gardening, is a fun and unique field guide that offers unique and sarcastic field notes about the identification of edible plants and the ongoing struggles of living in a post-zombie world. He gained his passion and knowledge of ethnobotany through his many years of service to the Native American community in Chicago. During that time, he developed an extensive culturally based science curricula that revolves around the traditional uses of plants of the Great Lake regions. Jeannie Roxas is a prairie band Potawatomi and has studied the environment through a multifaceted lens of traditional teachings as well as the humanities and science. Her interest is ethnobotany, and commitment to maintaining indigenous traditions has led her to develop culturally based, hands-on educational programs through gardening. She manages the Medicinal Garden Project at the Trickster Art Gallery, which provides resources for the support and education of indigenous traditions in the community. And Eli Suzukovich, Little Shell Band Chippewa Cree, and Karjina Serb, I hope I pronounced that correctly, is a lecturer in the Environmental Policy and Culture program at Northwestern University and Native American and Indigenous Research Institute faculty affiliate. Outside of Northwestern, he is an associate fellow in the Keller Action Science Center, located within the Field Museum of Natural History. Eli serves on the National Urban and Community Forestry Advisory Council, the Leadership Council for the Kateri Center of Chicago, and Native American Outreach Center for Chicago's Roman Catholic Archdiocese, and is involved with the Dunning-Reed Conservation Area Advisory Committee. I will now pass this over to Adam and begin our talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to try to hold this. I'm used to talking and moving around, so if I get up, don't be startled. That's just who I am. So thank you all for coming out tonight. And there's my opening slide. My name is Adam Kessel again. I am Lakota, Italian, and German. And my background in getting into environmental education and ethnobotany really started with the American Indian Center. There I was a teacher, and I didn't teach science per se. My background was in music. I love to play music, I love to perform music, and that's how I got involved in my community. I just volunteered and started teaching music lessons because that's what I knew, and that's what I thought I could share. And over time, this is kind of a long story, and I'll be brief. We were awarded a grant by the National Science Foundation, and that allowed us to hire some Native educators, Native scientists like Eli, and we had some great leadership at the American Indian Center. The American Indian Center is doing great things now too, and it allowed us to partner an educator, a Native educator like myself, with a Native scientist like Eli. And it allowed us to really reframe the way that we would teach science. And it started for our community in the garden. We had this outdoor space, and we wanted to reclaim it for our community to grow medicinal herbs for ceremony, medicinal herbs for prayer and for healing, and it really started there. And with that, I should back up. One of the reasons why this was important is because the state of Illinois doesn't have any federally recognized tribes, nor does it have any federally recognized lands for any of our regional tribes here. And what that means for folks is that a lot of times you got to go really far to get the plants that you need. Indigenous people don't have harvesting rights here, so that makes it difficult to acquire the plants that are needed for ceremony and to practice different tribal spirituality. So the Indian Center had space, and we had the opportunity to do something really unique with it. And we did. We started this garden. Let's see if I can get to the next one here. Hey, there it is. Okay, so really at the foundation of it was the garden. But we also got together with our elders, with our community leaders, and we wrote a curriculum. And it was heavily supported by Dr. Megan Bang. And this curriculum, the foundation of it, one of our elders started with a prayer. And in Lakota, we say, Matakwe Oasin. It's simply translated, it means we are all related. And it seems like a simple concept, but this is a deeply, deeply spiritual concept, and it's also a deeply scientific concept. And that's essentially what Native science is. For a long time, our traditions, our practices, language was pushed out by government policies like boarding schools, and folks were told this isn't the right way. But if you think about it, we are all related. We're related to the plants. We're related to the rocks. We're related to the earth. And while that's deeply spiritual, if we change the lens and say, well, in science, we're all deeply related as well, right? We're all basically made of the same elements, whether it's rocks, it's earth, right? This building. On a molecular level, we are all related. So that became our ground, really our anchoring practice. We grounded in that concept, and we wrote all the curriculum around that. And by doing so, every single place we went, in our garden, in our neighborhood, was our classroom. Every single place. One of my favorite stories, actually Eli, got the seeds for, in the center right here, I think we have a laser pointer. Yeah, so right there, that's wild tobacco, Nicotona rustica. It's field tobacco. Doesn't look like the tobacco that's a cash crop. It has very small leaves, very dainty plant, but it's an essential plant for prayer. It's an essential plant for a lot of our tribes right here. And we started growing it in pots. And every day we'd take the kids out and we'd go out and we talked about rebuilding our relationships with these plants. We'd call it remaking relatives. And the kids would greet the different plants. They'd name the different plants. And on one of our neighborhood walks, we were at this time, the Indian Center was on Ashland and Wilson. We were walking along Paulina south. And one of the kids was like, hey, Adam, I think that's tobacco growing through the sidewalk. And sure enough, it was. And that was exciting, right? This is indigenous land, and our plants call this place home, whether it's a beautiful prairie or we have this urban mountain range of all these buildings. Chicago's still native land for the people, for the plants, for all of our relations. So that was a really impactful piece, and that was my path to authorship was really heavily informed by all the time working in community. And people kind of caught on. Look at these young guys. So at first, native plantings, maybe the city was not all that excited about it. Not too long. You could be fined if you had grass in your backyard that was longer than 6 inches, right? Wasn't it about knee high? The garbage man could point it out and you'd get a fine. Well, if you grow native plants, you know, not a whole lot of native plants like to stay real low to the ground. So that was kind of a challenge, you know. People were like, what? The Indian Center has all these weeds growing in the front. Why do they just let that place go like that? But over time, it became a gateway in. It got non-native people really excited about what was going on, and the city too. We got a little award for it. So it was quite exciting to see how the plants helped to invite people in to learn more about our community here in Chicago and about some of our traditional plants and whatnot. So this is revisiting the land. We kind of went over that. Revisiting our lost relationships with plants and what's in our neighborhood. And why is knowing the land around you important? One of the concepts that we got into, and I'm going to jump to the next slide real fast because I don't want to take up too much time. This is the curriculum that was written as a result of this. You can kind of see some of the talking points, neighborhood walks, really important. If land's our teacher, then we can teach anywhere. We don't need a garden. We could teach in an alley. And a lot of these plants that we talk about that are important, they're growing right there. It doesn't take much. But when you see land as a classroom, you can teach anywhere. And after I worked at the Indian Center, I was a teacher over at Al Raby High School in East Garfield Park. There are a lot of vacant lots in East Garfield Park. They date back to when there were riots and folks burned some of the areas, and there wasn't a whole lot of reinvestment in those communities, so we had a lot of vacant lots. And some of those lots were not used for the most positive things for the community. And as a teacher, I had the kids start mapping things out. What lot would be a cool lot to try to take over? And we found one across the street. But as land being our teacher, we spread a whole bunch of wood chips, we got this lot ready to go, and some of the neighbors saw us working, and they were like, I think people were dumping out here. So we did some tests, and sure enough, the lead levels in that lot were through the roof. A tablespoon of that lead was enough to give a child lead poisoning. But the land was telling us a story. And as we got further and further along, the students said, what can we do about this? And then we started learning about phytoremediation. And phytoremediation is deeply an indigenous concept, right? That the land and the plants that are growing in the land are going to heal Mother Earth before they're ready for our consumption. So we are a part of the system. We're not at the top. So we created a phytoremediation garden there. And with raised beds, we were able to address some of the food desert issues that were in that community. But we also planted a lot of plants that love lead. Sunflowers, lead plant. We even planted some tobacco, though I didn't tell all the kids we planted tobacco. And it was a really exciting thing. Now, the garden today is not used by the school, but the nice thing about planting native habitats is even if it's not used by people, it's still a habitat. Our milkweed is still supporting monarch life. So that's one of those things that it's pretty empowering to see these places, even if people aren't utilizing them the way that they were originally intended, our wildlife still is. Our relatives are still using these places. So I'm going to wrap it up real quick and talk about my book. So zombie gardening is just that. It's about rebuilding our lost relationships. The whole book is all non-native species. So even invasive species that aren't native to our area, a lot of them were brought here by immigrant communities with purpose. And over time, folks have lost their relationships with those plants. So it's kind of a fun way to get folks excited about these quote-unquote weeds that are growing in the backyard. So there's a picture of one of the pages. One of my favorite plants is dandelion, for obvious reasons. It's got some really cool. It's a non-native, but it does so much, right? It's medicinal. It's edible, and it's got some great stories. So with that, I'll leave you with that. You guys could do some research on dandelion after this and find out what I'm talking about. So thank you all, and I'm going to pass the mic to Gina. Thank you.
Bonjour. Hello. So before I begin talking about Trickster and the garden project there at Trickster, I wanted to get you guys a little bit of background on what the importance of our medicinal garden is. Western science is a little different from indigenous science. Our basis of knowledge is oral traditions. So we don't have all of that terminology. Our language is very different. Many of the indigenous cultures is heavily verb-based, where English is noun-based. I think Potawatomi has 80% of its words are verbs. So a lot of the naming and a lot of the terminology is a verb, not a noun, not an object. And I think that kind of helps with our connection to nature. And these cultures, we were the first geneticists. We were the first farmers. We were the first scientists, the first doctors that found the value and the importance of our native plants here. So a little historical timeline. Many of us grew up, or at least I grew up in the Chicago school system, and when we talked about US history, the beginning was always when Columbus came. I want to change that. There were inhabitants 12,000 years ago, well before Columbus came. And so with that start point, it's problematic. It seems that, well, this land was not, there was no inhabitants. We just got here. And then now, in 2018, sometimes we forget that we're here. Sometimes some of the conversations, oh, there's natives here? There's Native Americans here? I thought you guys left. I thought you were extinguished. But we're not. We're here, and we're strong. And we have 12,000 years of knowledge that we can share and that we can learn from and help each other get through this world. And I just wanted to show you, these are, this is 5 generations of my family. In the upper right-hand corner, that's me fishing with my dad. The bottom black and white picture, that's my grandmother with her children at the community garden on the reservation. And the picture in the middle and the picture in the upper corner, those are my children. And right on the bottom, those are my kids at Trickster. So we've always been connected to the land and to plants and to gardening. That's where my knowledge comes from my family. So just a little bit about a couple of highlights of what we do at Trickster, some of the plants that we find of importance. And I want to talk a little bit about corn, Nundamnuk. It's the Potawatomi word for corn. And sometimes I think people forget that corn was an intentional domestication of a wild plant, a wild grass. It is very different, different looking than what it was. The wild grass is a teosinte right here. And it was 8,000 years ago that geneticists closely and carefully watched the land and watched the climate and watched these plants and picked the right ones and at the right time and at the right moment. And now we have this product that we call corn, which is used everywhere today. And so with the corn, we developed an agricultural system, a very sustainable agricultural system called the Three Sisters. That's with companion planting is what they're called now, planting corn and bean and squash together. So what happens is the corn grows very tall, you can see that there, and the beans are grown around it, and the beans are a vine, so they wind up and they grow up, stabilizing, the corn stalk stabilizes that bean, and the squash kind of grows low to the ground and is kind of a living mulch for that plant. And it's a whole small world, biosphere, that is created. And we think, wow, that's great, that's a beautiful thing, but this cannot happen without human input. And most of the times we think human input in nature as a result, it's destructive, it's hurting the land. But this is an example of how we can be connected with our plants, our plant nations, and with the environment. Medicine. So medicine today, you feel ill, you take a pill, and then hopefully feel better. With many native cultures, native medicine, it's not just your physical ailments that you need to look at. If you're not feeling well, you need to look at all 4 of of the aspects, the spiritual part, the physical, the mental, and the emotional. So you can't just, at times, take a pill. And sometimes these native medicines are not, quote unquote, scientifically proven. But I feel strongly that it doesn't need to be scientifically proven. We have, like I said, over 12,000 years of knowledge. An example is when I was about 4, I had pneumonia. Now, this is a story that's passed down to me, so maybe the details aren't as accurate. But I had pneumonia and I was hospitalized. And back then, parents couldn't stay with their children, so you had to leave. And I would cry and cry and cry. I pulled out my IVs. I wouldn't use the bathroom. I wouldn't eat. And this happened with my poor mom. She'd come and she'd have to, after work, and she'd have to console me, and it just wasn't working. I was getting worse and worse. Well, one day my dad came, saw what was going on, and the doctor said, hey, we have to restrain her. She keeps pulling her IVs out. She's getting worse. We don't know what else to do. He said, okay, let me take a look. Let me see what I can do. He grabbed me, wrapped me in a blanket, and walked out the door. And he walked next door to my great-grandmother and gave me to her. And she healed me. She healed me with her prayers, with her teas, with her herbal rubs. It's not scientifically proven that I was healed, but I'm still here, right? So I think that's proof enough. And it's those types of traditions, those types of teaching that I really would like to capture and be able to share, be able to keep those teachings alive. So this is our Trickster Garden project. These are some of the plants that we've been growing at the garden. So it's a garden that's surrounding the building, and we've grown. A lot of the plants are native to Illinois, and most of them don't need too much human intervention. But we did dabble in tobacco and the Three Sisters, which did need a lot of work. And this is some of our tobacco. We have two species. Like Eli said, the smaller species, which is there on the right, and then we have the larger one, which is the large leaves, which is on the table. And those grow up to like 7 feet tall. And then we have our sage. I wanted to highlight this sage here. That's the one that we grow in our garden. So it's a small little bushy area. But this is an area out at Specimen Ridge in the Dakotas. And I took a field study there over the summer, and we would call sage Mama Sage. And why we did that was because we would look at these sages. They were huge, huge plants, almost look like trees. And they're holding the land together. They're creating a space for other species to live. And more importantly, you see all the way in the background, these are the hills that are the ridge that we had to climb. I'm not a hiker, and so it was very hard for me to get up there, and then to get down was even worse. That's a very steep path to get down, and one of my friends was like, just hold on to Sage. She'll help you. And she did. I would grab onto the sage so I wouldn't fall. And you think especially if you're up close, you think I'm gonna pull this plant out. No, she was just like, I gotcha. It was very eye-opening for me. And then this other one is Rattlesnake Master. And this kind of led me to focus a lot of work on the medicinal qualities and the medicinal teachings. In one of my classes, we went on a field trip through the forest, the forest preserve, and there was Rattlesnake Master, and my professor said, "Oh, that's Rattlesnake Master. It's known to cure rattlesnake bites, but it's not scientifically proven." And then we moved on, and I thought, well, wait a minute. And actually, my philosophy teacher was like, you should maybe dig a little deeper and let's see. Let's try to get, maybe we just don't know yet how to use this plant. We haven't listened to what this plant has been telling us. And then I have a few more slides. They're just pictures of some of the plants that we use. And then some of the medicinal purposes are medicinal ways that they're used. And what I've done, I can easily Google this and find the information, but what we've been trying to do at Trickster is talk to the elders and ask them, what is this for? How do you use this? And they're the primary resource. It's easy to pick up a field guide and find this information, but to listen to the story that they give us is you get much more out of it. So that's one of the big things that we do at Trickster. We have a lot of helpers, multi-generational, multi-species. We have anyone can come to the garden. It's an open space, and we come and we garden there. We sit there. We hang out, and it could be anyone from a philosophy professor to my grandkids who are 3 or 4, and we all are together, and we all work at the garden and pull weeds or grow the plants or plant seedlings or pick some of the specimens that you see here. And that's how we learn from each other, but also we learn from the plants. So our classroom is the outdoors, and our textbook are the plants, and our teachers are the plants. And it's multi-generational. And like I said, it's multi-species too. We learn from the plants, we learn from the animals that inhabit these plants, and we learn from each other. We've even learned from our dogs. We've brought our dogs out, had them walk around the garden, leaving their scent and their fur to try to keep the critters out. So it's you guys should come and see. Thanks. Thank you.
So as he's getting that ready, just an update. I'm actually no longer a fellow at the Keller Action Science Center, but I work in the the Integrative Research Center, working on the Hall 8 Native North America Hall refurbishing. So there's just that update, and then here we go. So I got a lot of things in Cree because if I don't have it up there, I forget because there's no one really to talk to. So it helps me out. It drives my students crazy because they're sitting there writing it down. They're like, how do you pronounce this? I'm like, don't worry about it. Yeah. So when I found out Adam was going to be here, I thought, wow, this is really funny. We should just sit up here and exchange really fun stories of the dumb things we used to do in the name of science. So I guess, the topic of indigenous science, and I wonder, like, okay, what does that mean? And as a teacher, which one is this? Oh, there you go. So what does indigenous science mean? And I'm not a really good academic because I don't like a lot of academic terms, and I think that can mean anything. But as I know it, kind of my scientific career starts here. And if you're an avid writer of the CTA, you'll know this is the Skokie Swift line. Now, what you probably don't know is back in the 70s, so some of you probably remember, plants like echinacea, goldenrod, rattlesnake master, if they were in your lawn, they were noxious weeds. And if you go to the bookstore and find an old 1960s lawn care guide, everything that you're now planting in your gardens was considered a noxious weed. But back in the mid-70s, there was a group of people that wanted to start restoring prairies, but where do you find prairie plants in a state where most of the prairies have been wiped out? Well, my mom had a lead. The Skokie Swift line, because the CTA really didn't take care of it, they left it feral, and as a result, there was a huge amount of native species, and the Skokie Swift line was basically this miles-long native prairie that nobody knew about. So as a way to make money, I guess, my mom would take my sister and I out on a bike. And just to give you a sense, we lived in Uptown, so Ravenswood, or like Wilson and Ashland. She would drive all the way up to the Skokie Swift to Howard, and then we would follow it all the way up to like Oakton. So that was all on a bike. We didn't own a car. I was in the front, my sister was in the back. We would get there, and my mom would chuck us over the fence. I was about 3 years old, so that's about 1976. And when you're small, you fly over the fence real easily. I liked it. My sister was the law-abiding citizen, so she was like, this is wrong, because it said no trespassing. So she would watch the horse and later join us. But we would go in, and I guess technically this is illegal, but the statute of limitations is over. But we would collect roots and seeds and start supplying native plants for growers. And if you're familiar with Gethsemane Garden Center, the guy who started that was one of these early prairie restoration advocates. And I just remember our porch would be filled with seedlings and stuff, and people would come, they would take stuff, and it would be gone, and then a week later we'd have new stuff. And I never really thought about it. So when I think about like native science, I blame my mom. But she was doing something that she grew up doing. So in Montana, when she was a family up near like Shelby and Harlem, Chinook, she just remembers you get into a car and you drive somewhere, stop, go pick something, get back in the car, and just that was your day. And it was always some auntie saying, go pick that, go pick that, go pick that. There was always a sense, I remember when we started working with Adam, they wanted to know, like, well, what's the name? What's the name? And it's like, I don't know the name. They never tell me the name. They just said, pick it, because you're going to eat it. So just shut up, stop asking questions and do. And that's how my mom learned. So she would go into these fields in Montana, getting leafy greens, roots, all these kinds of things. But it'd always be somebody saying, like, hey, pick that, pick that. So we'd be on the Skokie Swift line, and my mom would be like, pick that, get those seeds, get that. And we're like, okay. And when you're 3, 4 years old, you don't care. It's fun. You're digging in the dirt. But it also allowed a lot of time for my sister and I to investigate these forested areas. So we saw bugs, a lot of dead animals, which my sister always makes fun of me because I wanted to take home a dead cat because it was like really fascinated. It was a skeleton. So we would do that, and we would ride back home with bags of plants and roots and cuttings on our laps. So we were also the mules. And that's what we did. And we never thought about it as science. It was just something to earn a little extra money. And it's something that I think when we think about science, the indigenous part of the sciences is the science comes in just the everyday thing of doing. And you don't really think about it. And then, in fact, in the Hailwa, we don't have a word for science. We have a word for harvesting, we have a word for cooking, we have a word for doing, but not like a specific science word. But that's where it starts. And I don't think my mom knew either. She's just like, this is how she was taught, and that's how she did it. So that's kind of where it starts. And then I never thought about plants. I didn't care about plants, but plants always followed me around. So when I worked at Native American Educational Services College, I was archivist and archives manager. So I liked to be outside, and if I could figure out a way to get outside, so I concocted this plan of building a prairie along the side of the building, and that would be our living archive, right? And my mom said, oh, you got a knack for it, because things were growing and all that. And Sally Wagner, who is one of the mentors for Adam and Megan and Angie DeCora and Julia Brownwolf, they had seen the garden and they thought it was really cool. So I went out to Montana to school, and Sally calls me up. She says, hey, we've got this native garden over at the Indian Center, but it's not doing so well. You think you can help us out? That was 2007, so I thought, oh, okay, I'll be back in town, so sure. Now, in that time I was out in Montana, I was going to grad school, but I also was a defense contractor with the Department of Army, and I worked with an engineering company that did ecological restoration, mitigation, and bomb disposal. So literally after a war, this was the company that goes out and cleans up things. So I spent a lot of time around explosives, but I worked with tribes in Montana and Wyoming. Whenever the Department of Defense would buy land or sell land, we'd have to go out and do a 106 and a 110 survey. and determining cultural value. And by U.S. law, any federal lands and state lands that go up for sale, treaty tribes have the first dibs on that. So it was also looking at like real estate. But I was an anthropologist. I'm still an anthropologist. But plants would always come up, and that was one of the things we would help establish with tribes was harvesting rights. And what a lot of people don't know is a lot of tribes actually go on military bases and military land to harvest traditional ceremonial plants, food plants, and such. So I kind of did that, and I figured, well, this will be fun. Go back to the Indian Center, and I don't know if Adam knew, but there was a guy in community, Roger Graham, AKA Farmer. We had joked back in early 90s, late 80s about, this would be a great place for a really good garden, and then find out. And then I met Adam. And he was just like this real chipper kid in college, all excited. So like, he just seems like a good guy. So I just originally thought I was going to go to the board, come up with a plan, head back to Montana, and that's it. And then, so we're out there doing some work, and then Adam goes like, hey, would you like a job? I'm like, sure. So I helped design the garden, and it was funny too because Adam was going into school to be a teacher, so he knew about all his teaching. I'm not a good teacher. I didn't think of myself as a teacher. He proved me wrong. And so we were setting up the garden, and when he talks about the way the city reacted to a prairie garden, we literally got asked by even folks in the botanic garden, like, why are you growing weeds? And so I knew we were in the bad streets. But we persisted, and the curriculum that we worked on, and let me go to the next. So that's the garden at full, I think we actually burned a lot of that. So back when Cook County had the burn ban, we were burning at the Indian Center. And that's really a funny story because in Montana, people burn normally. It's just kind of like what you do. Apparently you don't do that here in Chicago. But I told Adam, I said, do you want to do some test patches, just see what happens, right? So when we designed the garden, we didn't throw any of the biomass away. That all became soil, and it all became berms and stuff like that. So there was this berm that was really convenient for hiding whenever we'd hear sirens. And so we're out there with a little propane torch, and we burned a few areas. And we thought, like, what's the worst that can happen, right? And so we got carried away one time. We were just like burning, and all of a sudden we hear sirens. We're like, oh crap! We put it out and, hide, and then they passed, and then it was an ambulance. But but that spring we had plants that had been in the soil in front of the Indian Center that probably hadn't bloomed in about 150 years. So we went from 25 species to probably about 50. We got 25 more that we didn't even know. And it worked. And of course, our boss, Megan Bang, said, wow, that's great. Make it into a curriculum. It's like, oh. Every time Adam and I tried to do something, it would be like, hey, that's science. Make it into a curriculum. It's like, oh. Cannot escape work. And he's a better writer than I am, so I always look to him. So it expanded, and one of the things we did was maple tapping. And this idea of tapping maple trees in Chicago or any city, as far as I know, has not been done. And I talked to a friend up in Minnesota because I always figured Minnesotans are just, and Vermontians are always like tapping maple trees. Apparently not. But he was doing something with black walnuts. He's a enrolled member of Cherokee Nation, and he was making kanuji. He had his students making like a pudding type stuff. So he thought that was kind of cool, and so we started doing it. So this tree here is a 70-year-old silver maple that's still standing at the corner of Paulina and Wilson, and every spring it would drip. So one of the things that we had to do was think about 4 seasons outdoor curriculum, and what do you do in the wintertime, right? So one of the guys we worked with, Al Eastman, and I thought like, hey, why don't we go tap a tree? It's traditional, right? And it works. And the guy who lived in front said it was okay, and we called the alderman's office, and we said, hey, is this going to be a problem? And they're like, well, we've never heard of it, so we don't know if it's going to be a problem. But But they told us, when the city marks trees that are being inoculated, like what little colors to watch out for. And they said, I said, well, will forestry pull it off? And they said they're understaffed and underpaid, and unless it's a work order, they don't care. So we're like, awesome. So this is actually the second year that we tapped the tree, and the first year we pulled about 5 gallons. Second year we got a little smarter and we pulled about 20. And then the fourth year, I believe, we got something around 35 gallons. And we started expanding throughout the block, and our neighbors, man, I don't know, our neighbors probably miss us. Yeah. We were just tapping people's trees. I mean, it was on the street, so it's public property, And the funny thing is, we never thought about, is this stuff toxic? Is it dangerous? So we were working with the U.S. Forest Service with their Region 1 lab up in Rhinelander. And so I think it was Bill Burr, and I said, hey, can we test the sap? And he's like, yeah, that would be really great. I don't think anyone's ever tested maple sap in the history of maple tapping. Everyone just assumes it's safe. So like, okay. So, we did cooked and raw, and we actually found out that the sap in the trees was cleaner than the tap water. So just, run your water through a tree. So it was a fun activity, and we got into like astronomy as well, because as this thing called climate shift and climate change, whatever you want to call it, is happening. So that first year we only had 5 gallons because our season was literally a week. And so we tried to think like, okay, as the temperature's changing, maybe we have to resort to other types of calendars. So we started, I think it was Fawn Pichel, Dave Bender, Janie Pichel. We were kind of thinking about, and Al Eastman too, like, well, maybe we should think about like celestial calendars. Well, that opened up into an astronomy unit, because of course you can imagine Megan's like, turn that into a curriculum. And this is how science happens, by the way. No one ever plans it. It just, you do something and your boss tells you, write that down. And so we actually started playing around with the calendar, and then in 2014, I was no longer working at the Indian Center, and I was working at Northwestern, and we were thinking about, well, how do we expand what we did at the Indian Center to a non-native audience? Like, how do you teach native science or indigenous science to non-native people? And that was my mentor, Doug Medine, and I said, thanks, Doug, that's great. And so we have a lot of maples, so I thought, okay, well, let's do it. So Doug writes this email to the provost at the time and says, hey, we want to tap maple trees and make it into this, just a program, right? Provost literally gave us $5,000. Said, buy whatever you need. And we're like, okay. So the second day, we put out an email list, like saying, advertising what we're doing. We were expecting maybe 10 people at best. We had 75 hits from students, faculty, and staff. And apparently, it's a very rare occasion when students, faculty, and staff are all into doing the same thing on campus. So Doug and I were like, oh, okay, what do we do? So this is over, which one is, oh. So we have the Indian Center one, then we have Northwestern, and really there was no thought about doing any kind of science because we didn't really know what to do. But I started noticing that the trees were behaving differently. And so I said, hey, this would be a really good class. Also, we needed it as a class because maple tapping, how many of you have ever done it? It's a lot of work, right? And you're working every day and you gotta be on it. So we proposed a class in 2015, and so when you do a class, you have to think of like, what are you talking about? So one of the things you always hear is, the maple crisis, and you hear these maple growers in the Northeast and Midwest, and oh my God, climate change is killing the industry, and this apocalyptic. And it's something I noticed with like Western science is they're into this apocalyptic worldview, like everything's ending, we need to get to a ship to go to Mars, and it's like, no, I don't know, we can't go to Mars, we can't afford it, but so we're stuck here. So I thought that was a really great question, and something in the environmental policy and culture we talk about is climate change and how does it affect people? So that was the big question, ecological, cultural, or economic crisis. But also thinking about rethinking seasonality and measuring time. So for like a lot of our cousins, Potawatomis, they have a sugaring moon. For Crees, we don't really have a sugaring moon. Our calendar is either based on snow geese or bison and the calving and hatching seasons. So this was easy for me. Our Anishinaabe, brothers and sisters, I don't know, they're a little harder. But we thought about that, like when does the sugaring moon go beyond 30 days, or do you have to move it? So it was a great philosophical question for the students, and I think for a lot of Native community members as well, like rethinking seasonality. And I put perspectives and experiences. So the second year I did this, Bill Quackenbush, Tipo from the Ho-Chunk tribe, came down to talk, and he was talking about Ho-Chunk perspectives of maple tapping. And the students were actually really fascinated to find out that Ho-Chunks prefer silver maples and wild cherry over sugar maple. And it was a really great perspective because I would add in that originally for Crees, we didn't tap maple trees because we remember a time when up north there was no maple trees, but we had poplars. And so now the students their minds were getting blown because the industry always thinks of sugar maple. So what I tell my students is, what other trees are there? So, and a lot of Native communities don't just tap sugar maples, they trap other types of trees. And so also I thought about, it's not always about syrup, right? Why did we originally do this? And so it led us into taxonomy. So that's a black poplar over at the end, and I don't know how to use the pointer. Oh, okay. So this is the tree for a lot of Crees. This is the tree that we originally tapped. Black poplars used to be very common throughout the Midwest and up into northern Canada. But this word right here, it actually means the nasty woman tree. And when I was talking with Bill, Ho-Chunks have a very similar story to us. And one of the things is in our case, it's a woman who was trying to get rid of her husband. And she had been successful of like getting rid of husbands because she didn't want to be married and she wasn't into it, but her parents always insisted. So she'd scare their husbands away, until she married this idiot. And then he was deeply in love with her, so no matter what she did, she couldn't get rid of him. So one day she was chopping wood, and just frustrated, threw the axe, and it hit this gnarly-looking tree, and this like clear liquid starts coming out of it. And she tastes it because it looked like water, and it's really nasty. And by the way, if you ever try poplar and willow sap, it's nasty. She's like, oh, this is awful. It stinks. So she's like, I know what I'll do. I'll cook my husband the worst dinner possible that will wipe the smile off his face because this stuff is really bad. And so she put it in a little container, started cooking deer meat. And the thing is with sap, as you cook it, it starts getting a little sweet. Well, her mother-in-law comes in and it's like, oh, this smells really good. And everybody's like, man, this smells really good. And so finally the husband gets home and he's like, man, this smells really good. Oh, I'm hungry. He's all excited. And the wife's like, yes, you're going to go. He eats it and he starts eating more. He's like, wow, this is the best food I've ever had. And he gives it to his mom because he was a bit of a mama's boy. And then she eats, oh my God, this is great. My daughter-in-law is like the best cook ever. Everybody's eating this. And the woman's just like, what is up with people? And she's tasting, she's like, wow, this is really good. They're like, what's your recipe? And so she didn't get rid of her husband, but she became incredibly famous for figuring out this, like, how to make food really taste good. And so she took people back to the tree. But because she was always mean and disagreeable to the day she died, that's why they call her the nasty woman. It translates into English, but it means like the miserable, like somebody who's just angry and just, combative. But and I tell my students that, and the Ho-Chunks, their version is they call the lazy woman. It was an older woman that didn't want to go to the river to get water, so she would just tap the trees and get her water that way. He's smart. But Bill and I would talk about that, and when we think about stories, and something that we did at the Indian Center is like, how do you use stories as passing on knowledge? And it sounds fun, but a lot of we used a lot of those stories, I think, in the curriculum with the kids, and a lot of times the kids would remember the stories and follow what the stories did. And I suspect that's what my mom did. That's why she was always like, go that, do that, do that. Don't eat that. And so one of the things I want to think about was taxonomy. And it was something that we did at the Indian Center is how do we get out of a Linnaean system? And wait, okay, we're done. All right, so real quick, we did taxonomy. Talked about nuts because we also tapped beech and black walnut. This is some of the results that we found. In fact, we turned a 1-month season into a 4-month season, just simply by following temperature and what the trees are doing in different tree species. We also listened to the woodpeckers for scouting out really good trees versus really bad trees. And that's a little bit what we did. And thank you.
So before we open it up to everybody to ask questions of the panel, I have a couple questions that I'll pose and we can kind of jump in. Eli, you talked a lot about native science. Gina, did you have anything that you wanted to add in terms of your thoughts on that?
Well, native science, I believe, is a Western term. Like Eli had said, there really is, I don't think for Potawatomi there's a word for science. It's just a being, a way of life. If you had to define native science, I believe it would be the integration of oral traditions, elder teachings, along with some philosophy, and maybe that's what native science would be. That would be my definition.
Going on from there, as you guys all heard us speaking, we have 3 different tribes represented on this panel. Within the gardens, how did you guys address tribal diversity? I'll just answer my own question.
Well, I mean, that was a big issue. For a lot of tribal communities, it's easy to do it because there's only like 1 or 2 tribes. But Chicago has something like 150 plus federally recognized tribes. And then that's not including Canadian and state recognized tribes. So, and then I think our makeup, we had a lot of different kids.
We did.
I mean, that was a problematic thing, but it was actually a really great question, right? Like, how do you do it? And I think what we ended up doing is we could only speak from our own perspectives. So if Adam and I were with the kids, or George Strack was another teacher who was Miami, we would look at a plant or a particular animal and we would just talk about it from our own perspective. And George and I, because Miami and Cree is very similar, so he would say something in Miami, I'd say it in Cree, and we would talk about the differences in the language. So even though we were related, how we categorized plants, animals, how we would talk about that. And then it actually spurred a lot of the kids to actually talk to their parents and grandparents. And a lot of their kids did not know that their grandparents still spoke their language. One of the things is like, oh, nobody speaks their language. And these kids are like, would talk about something, and then all of a sudden their grandmother would be like, oh yeah, blah, 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 and start talking and saying what it is. And the kids are like, really? Now you tell us. And on that, I think one of the best was Priscilla Curley, one of our elders. We were out doing a unit. I think it was some like game with the kids, and Priscilla, who speaks, her first language is Ojibwe. She was with her daughter, and they were walking through the garden, and as soon as she stepped foot in the garden, she only spoke Ojibwe. And I remember I looked over at Adam looked over at George and Cindy, and we're just like, okay, we told the kids, quiet. And we had, I think 20 kids follow Priscilla in the garden with her daughter, and the entire time it was nothing but Ojibwe, but she was pointing to the flowers, pointing to things, and that I think was really good for the kids to start thinking about their own language and what these plants are, and even finding out that some of these plants don't exist in their language. because they come from different regions. So I don't know if we solved it, but I think we at least promoted the use of language.
Yeah, I think at that time I was going through a teacher's education program over at National Lewis, so just a few blocks down on Michigan. And one of the big pieces was how do you integrate diversity of your classroom? And I thought, wow, well, we're kind of doing that every day with our tribal diversity. If you looked at the demographics of our classroom, and one of the big challenges is this idea of pan-Indianism, right? There's one Indian, everybody's the same, but we have tons of different tribes, tons of different languages, and we just needed to be okay with, as teachers, we don't know everything and we can ask for help. And it created a wonderful opportunity to put that back on our kids too and say, hey, you know, we really want this classroom and this learning to be communal, so we need your help to make that happen. And that's Priscilla coming in and speaking Ojibwe and us being like, yes, we're just gonna step back. And being okay with that team teaching, and it's kind of a dance, right? You just, sometimes one person leads, sometimes you gotta stand back and follow everybody else, and I think that a traditional classroom in Indigenous communities isn't age segregated. And that goes from your youngest person in that classroom to your oldest. And as a teacher, I was learning from the little ones, because they would pick things out that I'd never, I'd miss, right? You kind of have your teacher blinders on, and you're like, oh, I've got to hit all these learning objectives, and we wrote it up this way, so God forbid we digress. But in a traditional sense, everybody's a teacher, and being okay with relinquishing the classroom to let learning happen. That was the way that tribal diversity I thought played out for us. So, excellent.
At Trickster, we don't have a traditional classroom. It's open to anyone. It's open to everyone within the community, also outside the community. We have visitors that come from Wisconsin, from the West, from the South, and they come and they work with us whenever anyone has time. So I don't think it was problematic. I think it was more beneficial. You just have to be comfortable with the teacher becoming the student. I had a class come on one of their 8th grade trips. They came all the way from Michigan. I don't remember the tribe. And we're walking around in the garden, and there was a young boy who was like, oh yeah, I know these plants. My grandmother has them in their backyard, in our backyard. But we don't call it this, we call it that. And we don't call this something, we call it that. And I was like, wait a minute. And I ran back inside, and I was grabbing a piece of paper and a pen, like, wait, what did you say? How do you say it? And it's a great experience, being able to, these guys said, to kind of take a step back and learn from each other, and then also learn from the plants and learn from the little ones. One of our younger garden members, she was watering the sunflower, and she kept going back and forth with the little watering can. And just, you know what? That's enough water. No. I talked to the sunflower, and she said she needs more water, and so she got more water. I said, oh, okay, all right.
So with the projects that we've done, could you guys name some of the unforeseen challenges and successes? Either or none.
One of the challenges this season was the growing season. It was so problematic. We wanted to start growing, and we had a set date for growing, but we kept waiting for the thaw. And we ended up having to go kind of a non-traditional method in growing from seedlings. So my poor husband, our kitchen table was full of these seedlings. He had this little area where he's eating his breakfast. He was surrounded by all these plants. And we just kept waiting. I'm like, next week maybe. No, next week maybe. And that was one of the unforeseen obstacles we had.
I think it's always, I guess it would be funding is a big thing, but also having a permanent stretch of land to work on. It's something with, like at the Indian Center, we had the garden for a long time, but then the center moved. And then we moved a lot of our plants to a rail embankment down the street, and they're actually doing really great. But it's that idea of, especially in the city, like having just a permanent place to grow and keep growing, I think is really a challenge. And if you can get it, then you hold on to it as long as you can.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. Having access to land. And with that, I think we're going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. So if you have any burning questions to ask, there will be some staff kind of floating around with microphones. So to end it, we kind of covered this, and it was great with Eli's story, but are there any other traditional stories? We talked about the three sisters, and we talked about the grumpy old lady. Are there any other traditional stories that you've integrated into gardening and teaching either kids or the community?
I can answer. I'd like to elaborate on the three sisters. I kind of glossed over that really quickly. So with the three sisters, there is a traditional Iroquois story of why they're called the three sisters. Why it's grown that way and how it's been used is that what happens with the corn is very nitrogen hungry. And the beans, when the beans grow together with that, they have a bacteria in their roots that change the atmospheric nitrogen to nitrogen that the plants can use. So for the next season, that corn has the nitrogen for it. And like I said, the squash works as a living mulch, keeping the bugs and keeping the moisture in. The root system of that squash plant, because all of the roots of the corn go straight down, the squash knows not to crowd and knows and is able to maneuver their root system and go sideways so that they can find water too. It's a very symbiotic relationship between those three. And then how the human, or us, how we benefit from that. If you eat corn, squash, and beans, that's a complete meal. You have the protein from the beans, you have the carbohydrates and the sugars from the corn, and you have all the vitamins that you need from the squash. It's a very sustainable way of growing and sustainable way of eating.
Thank you. Eli, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I guess with stories, like my daughter wants to be a toxicologist, so I take her out and there's stories about like poisonous plants and how to use them and what they're used for. And like right now we're actually growing Manatuskakuk, which is ginseng, American ginseng. So we've got actually a couple ones on the back porch, and that's sort of our project. So as the plants grow, then the stories that go with it and what it's used for and all that. It's not a poisonous plant, but it's, figure you gotta have something you can eat, you know.
Yeah, right. Thank you. All right, so now we're going to open it up to all of you.
I just have a comment and then a question. The incomplete protein in the corn complements the incomplete protein in the bean to make a complete protein. Mm-hmm. So actually, if you eat them together, they make a complete protein, which is an excellent way of having a legume with a seed, with a grass like that. Mm-hmm. So the same way that wheat works with beans. But is there going to be any possibility of having a garden at the new Indian Center, or just the land doesn't allow for it?
I can speak to that a little bit. There's not space on the actual site of the new building, but there is a community garden plot that they're working on. I think it's a block or two away, if I'm understanding correctly. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I know that there's some information on their website that you could check out. Okay.
We have an online question. Gina mentioned that the rattlesnake master plan has been proven to cure rattlesnake bites, but not scientifically. Are there efforts being made to prove native healing theories scientifically on a research level?
Yes.
Could you elaborate?
So, University of Maryland Medical School, they actually are looking at pharmaceutical uses and just kind of looking at Culpeper's Guide, which actually has a lot of native plants and their uses, and kind of going through that. But it's hard to say because a lot of pharmacognosy programs are being shut down and being replaced by pharmacy programs. So I think in some ways they are being investigated, but I think it's something that within a lot of tribal communities is being done, but a lot of that knowledge is kind of being kept within, it's kind of being kept quiet just because of biopiracy and things like that. It's pretty hush-hush, so I would say yes, but no. There.
All right, and we have our next audience question.
What's some advice you would give to a beginner starting from scratch with land here in Chicago with regard to sustainability and growing things that are harmonious for each other, for instance, like the Three Sisters?
I can speak to my experiences kind of taking over a vacant lot. Start with your alderman and get a group of people together. Generally elected officials, they respond a little better with numbers. So, and have a plan, you know, that's kind of what we did over there. I didn't live in that community, but I just walked and talked to people and got people interested about what was going on that land. There's an organization called Neighbor Space, and they can, if there's a vacant lot, they kind of hold it for the community garden. It's available now, I'm fairly certain still. So that's a great organization to try to keep the work that you do in that garden a garden and not a new, you know, loft.
All right, and our next online question is, what are your thoughts on non-natives using ethnobotanical practices? Do you view it as appropriation or appreciation?
Could I jump into this one? Yeah. I think that culture is dynamic, just like language. You know, in Ojibwe, the greeting is Buju Anin, right? Traditionally, it's Anin. And Buju is a nod to the first European trade partners, right? Bonjour, Buju. Sounds very similar. So in terms of ethnobotany, I feel like the more folks know about it, the more it becomes something that is embedded in what we do, and it's important to build that relationship with place. If folks don't care that our native plants are medicine, why would they care about conserving our natural spaces? You know, and that's something that impacts native and non-native communities as we move forward. So for me, I think any vehicle that gets people interested and excited about the natural world and preserving the places that we have so that our other relatives that are non-human have a place to live too, I think it's a pretty important thing to push.
I think it's a little bit of both. I think, as like Adam's saying, is you have to respect it. But I think that every human on Earth has a relationship with plants. Every culture has a relationship with plants. And I think people need to look to who they are and what their traditions are and start there. But you have to get appreciation. Plants can do a lot of good things for you. They can do a lot of bad things if you don't know what you're doing and you're kind of being arrogant about it. I think a lot of people see like, oh, you know, traditional medicine people, like, oh, they just learned it right then and there. But there's people that will focus on maybe one or two species of plants their entire life. And they're like the experts on that particular plant. And this is not that different from other parts of the world. So I think that you have to have that respect. But if people are I wouldn't say, you should look at ethnobotany, you should understand it, ask questions. But I would say for non-native folks, and the thing is for a lot of native folks, it's what we we start from where we come from. And, you know, when we had like the non-native species, the reason dandelion and plantain got incorporated because a lot, by now, those plants have already been here and they have names in our languages. So we consider it a part of our repertoire. And I think as people live here longer, new plants become part of that repertoire. But I think you have to respect it first and start there.
For me, I think ethnobotany should be shared, but it also should be acknowledged where this is coming from. Who are the ones that are providing this wealth of information? So using ethnobotany, we're not saying, oh, we just discovered this plant that can cure whatever ailment it is. No, we didn't do that. Our ancestors did. And from the perspective of the Potawatomi, we are all immigrants. Our creation story starts with Sky Woman falling, and we came, even us as our so-called indigenous cultures, we're immigrants too, and we need to learn from our elders, which are the plants, and acknowledging that respect and that information.
Hi. Similar topic. I've heard, I don't know if this is a commonly used term, but I'm increasingly more concerned about things like biopiracy. As you know, we get more connected to our ancestral medicine, that magic that comes from the earth. We see it, I've been seeing it be studied, you know, on an institutional level. And there's lots of concerns about that knowledge being exploited. For example, the indigenous people of Chiapas make something called pozol, which is basically fermented corn. And in 2000, I think it was, the University of Minnesota began studying it, isolated, you know, the magic that the plant makes, and then tried to patent it, rendering it, you know, kind of basically illegal for other people to sell or use that product for its, you know, medicinal use. Is that something that you all have encountered at your institutions, and what can we do to kind of stop that?
I think more venues like this, where we are able to bring our ancestors' voices forward. It's harder to steal something when you know who it belongs to. So more education, more teaching, again, more like what we're doing here, sharing of information, so that when something does come out with some sort of new pharmaceutical, we can say, hey, wait a minute, no, that's wrong. And the more people that say, no, that's wrong, the stronger our voices.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Gina. I thought that was well said.
Okay. Are you aware of other initiatives to connect ethnic minorities to their social and natural ecology?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that even at the Indian Center, when we started, we were looking at invasive species, and if anyone's been to any of the forest preserves, you know we have a couple big ones. Garlic mustard is one of them. And we went out on a work day, and this was right after the moratorium was lifted, and for some time there was no restoration efforts happening in the forest preserves. And we were harvesting garlic mustard, and the Indian Center was not too far away from the Dankhaus, which is a German cultural center. And garlic mustard is a German culinary herb, so we thought it would be kind of cool to reach out to the German Cultural Center and see what they thought of that plant, and then we had an exchange there. So even in that place, we were out there on the premise of removing this invasive species, but rebuilding our relationship with that plant, and part of it was acknowledging the community that brought it here, and why'd you bring it here? and why can we talk about it, you know? And it was it's a pretty interesting plant. Has anyone ever pulled garlic mustard? You know, you start off and these bags, they smell of garlic mustard, and it makes you hungry for bratwurst. I kid you not. You know, and you're like, oh, I totally get why it was brought here, because I want to go to Al's right now and get a brat. So it's a really great way, and I think, as we said, sharing these opportunities to see cross-cultural partnerships, and maybe the Indian Center and the Native community is really good in Chicago about acknowledging these plant relatives and using them as a teaching platform. But there are lots of plants, and if the land is the teacher, then each plant reveals itself in different ways and invites in opportunities to work with other communities.
Yeah, and at the Field Museum, we have a lot of programs. Actually, our Science Center works with, our Killer Action Science Center works with folks in the Calumet region, Bronzeville, Pilsen, on working with like restoration, but also with the American Indian Center as well. So at least for the Field Museum, it's kind of this sort of central point where a lot of communities in Chicago can come together and work on these types of exchanges and planning. So it's happening. I know at Northwestern, we're, with the maple tapping, for example, we're spanning out to Pokagon and Huron communities, Potawatomi communities, but also with a lot of folks on the North Shore who never really thought about the North Shore as being forested land and native land. So I would say that the roots are stretching out into these different areas.
Hi. I guess my question is, there's been a growing interest that I've noticed in permaculture, and I was kind of curious from, I guess, the perspective of the indigenous communities, if the philosophies and practices of permaculture are, if you can compare and contrast those practices of permaculture and of those of the indigenous communities.
So they're actually the same thing. So kind of that question about like appropriating and biopiracy and these things. So the permaculture is this term that a couple of Australians came up with because they invented this stuff, even though that style of cultivating is done around the world. What they call mound agriculture, it's permaculture. Out west, for example, in Montana, a lot of the huckleberry patches are essentially permaculture. They're cultivated berry patches. A lot of fires are set to get rid of trees, and so that way huckleberry and Oregon grape and currants can grow. A lot of people don't think of that as permaculture, but it is. Because you can't really cultivate huckleberry, but you can if you burn them and you do these sort of natural processes. And that's all permaculture is just working with the plant's natural ability. And kind of to your question about, starting a Three Sisters garden in the city, Chicago has heavy clay soils, and one thing we found at the Indian Center was things like sunchokes and a lot of beans will actually grow fairly nicely. A lot of, it's just kind of working with the soil. So I would say permaculture is, I don't like that term just because it's just a marketing term, but everybody around the world does permaculture in some way, shape, or form. So yeah, I would say it's pretty universal. Don't tell the Australians though.
Has there been a campaign to petition the Illinois DNR to get harvesting rights in state parks? Is there a legal framework?
So by definition, anything that's a state or federal land there's no harvesting. And I almost got Adam in trouble at a presentation, posing the idea that are harvesters actually poaching or are they actually just doing a cultural practice. Right now, at least at the National Park Service, which does not allow harvesting, there's a study going on with the Nisqually at Mount Rainier, and the Nisqually want to open up a co-management plan on Mount Rainier to harvest beargrass, pipsissewa, and other plants. The study's actually been very successful, and it's actually showing that human interaction with the plants actually thrive and they're healthy. And of course, the Nisqually know that, but there's still a lot of Park Service employees that feel no humans should be harvesting anything and humans will just destroy everything. Forest Service is a little different, and on Forest Service land there are harvesting rights, and on Department of Defense and Department of Transportation land there's actually harvesting that happens, but states are still a little sketchy about it. But on that note, I am going to be in conversation with folks in Cook County Forest Preserves about doing a study on what are those effects. So we'll see. We'll update you in the future.
Kuali Tonali, Newa Motoka Quetzalcihuat. Good evening, Nilse, to everybody. I just wanted to say thank you so much for opening up this space here in a public location about these talks about our relationship with the native plants. As a Mexica traditional Aztec dancer, my ancestors also have studied for a very long time. I don't know if, like you said, there's a word for the word, it might be observation, the word of science that you were saying. But the ancestors were profound observers of the movements of the stars in the sky and how it related with the earth. The Mexica people of the South, or the Native American peoples of the South that are still there today, again, in the limelight, but they're still speaking their language. I just wanted to mention that there's Mexican traditional medicine that also hasn't been spoken about, like the Mexican traditional medicine, like the Iztafiate, the Ruda, the manzanilla. All my relatives, very glad that my mother grows these plants in her garden. But if it wasn't for my mom or my great-grandmother, I wouldn't know this information. So with that, with a group of friends, we're trying to come up with gatherings this Friday to talk about La Medicina Tradicional de Mexico, traditional Mexican medicine. And so just really grateful to be here and to hear how you're also encouraging that every culture or everybody also look in their own kitchen and find out more about their herbs, more about their family recipes, more about how we can start there in the home to relate with then the bigger problems that are happening, so that we don't have this thing of the Monsanto. That's one of my worries, is that the plants and how today we're talking about cloning. I mean, our ancestors knew about cloning when they made the corn different colors. So they already knew about that. But I think that, so if you're going to go out there and plant and you're going to go out there and share this, I think it comes with a lot of responsibility. So I'm glad that everybody's here interested in this topic, but it comes with a lot of responsibilities. So just glad that you shared all the stories that you did. Thank you so much.
Gina, you mentioned that about 80% of Potawatomi is a verb, and how that facilitates or encourages a relationship or a connection with nature and with the earth. And that really resonates with me, but in a way that I can't quite put my finger on. So could you reflect a bit more on that, or just talk a bit more on that? And Adam and Eli, I'd love any other thoughts you have on that also.
Sure. So for particularly naming, I think Eli touched on that with the Linnaeus system. You have, very categorized names for these plants. In Potawatomi, a lot of the naming is a verb, so it's a being, it's an action. It changes that perspective of a noun being an object-subject relationship, where now it's we're all beings. Potawatomi language also is non-gendered, so it's all inclusive. So for me, with naming in any traditional language, I think language is very important. How it's named and what things are named is just extremely important. There's words for a mushroom. I forgot the name of the mushroom. I'm drawing a blank, but it's a mushroom. And in Potawatomi, the translation is "that who comes up." When we walk in the forest preserve, we say, "Oh, that's a mushroom." So that's the difference between the naming as a verb or naming as a noun.
Okay. What can we as Chicago residents do to protect native plants and encourage their growth beyond visiting these gardens?
Grow them. A lot of these plants can be grown, but like Eli said, some of them can't be cultivated. They just resist. They won't be cultivated. So just having an appreciation, walking through a forest preserve, that's probably the closest thing to nature that we can have in Chicago. And just trying to, see what's out there. And again, grow plants, visit community gardens, that type of stuff.
Yeah, when my daughters were born, I got really interested in when do you teach your kids? Aren't we? If as parents, we're always teaching, and for me, it was empowering to think that no matter where we are, we could talk about these plants. It's not happening somewhere else. It's happening in our backyard. So, to add with what Gina was saying, acknowledge them that they're there. Take some time to just look in I'm telling you, in the alleys and the sidewalks. It's hilarious. Once you start identifying some of these plants, you'll see 5 of the same plants all the time throughout Chicago, whether in an alley, on a sidewalk, in a parkway, in a vacant lot. But once you start changing your perspective and getting an eye for it, you'll get really excited when you see a 6th plant and then a 7th plant. And then maybe native plants too. You're like, oh my gosh, they're here too. Everybody's here. So it's fun to be able to start seeing all of the landscapes as native landscapes.
Thank you so much for letting us helping us redefine science in our time. My comment and question would be that a family on the west side recently were tapping elm and maple in the parkways, and they were actually stopped by 2 city departments, and their equipment was confiscated after 2 years of doing this and making the most delicious syrups. What would you suggest that they do in this case?
Be smarter. I actually know who you're talking about. I think we started that, Adam. But it really means talking with the alderman, and something like Adam said, like talking to your alderman and getting them on board of what you're doing. One thing at the Indian Center, before we even tapped, that was the first thing we found out. And when the alderman's office said, yeah, that shouldn't be a problem, and then having the Forest Service kind of do the testing, because a lot of times they'll say, oh, it's a public health issue, and we had the data say, no, it's not. But we asked, and we kind of scoped it out before, and it's something that I guess, when we talk about native science, so one of those things is before you go hunting, before you go harvesting, you actually walk an area, you get familiar with it. And I think if people are going to tap in front of their house, walk the neighborhood, talk to the neighbors. Something I tell my students is when we say sugar bush, it's not a place, it's a state of being, that everybody's involved. And that it means also talking to your alderman, letting them know what they're doing. Because a lot of times, in the 47th, if there was a question, we could go to the alderman's office and they would kind of say, oh no, we already knew about this, or they would ask for us. But it was kind of, we weren't really being slick about it. I mean, we were pretty upfront. I think just people thought what we were doing was really weird, so they just wanted to see what happened. But I would say talk to your neighbors, get other folks involved, and just let people know. And, don't go crazy the first time. Like, just one tap is fine. But also know the tree that you're tapping. And I think that's something from a lot of Native communities, we just don't tap or we just don't harvest from a particular area. Sometimes it may be 10 years before you can harvest. And it's that letting the plants have that time to grow and to be healthy. And I think something I know with a lot of families that were interested in tapping when we had our Urban Explorers program, they would have us come out and check the tree. And sometimes the trees were not healthy, and we'd say, don't even, just leave it alone. But it's that asking first, and it's that preparation. I guess that's the science of it, is, doing your research and really, because I always tell my students, I said, you're drilling a hole into a living organism, and you're taking its blood. So really think about what you're doing before you do it. And that's something my mom would say, because there's a lot of, like I said, like when we were little, there was a lot of poisonous things. My mom was like, don't just grab, really think about what you're doing first. And I don't know, I think that a lot of teachings are like that. It's just that, it goes back to that respect. So I would say really do your due diligence before you do anything. So.
Yeah, I think asking for forgiveness rather than permission worked in our favor a few times, but not all the times. And a lot of times when we would go out to do these different things, we'd have a group of, a dozen high school kids, and then we'd be out in front of someone's house looking up at the tree and pointing, right? People would come out like, what are these? What are you looking at? It's just a tree. And it was these kind of informal opportunities to talk to people about what we were doing that got them on our side. And then they become your advocates, So when the city comes out, the homeowner comes out and says, well, no, you're not taking that down. They're tapping maple trees. And then they become your advocates. You don't have to be everywhere all the time, but they're in the loop. They're excited because obviously if you're out there talking about trees, you're going to be pretty excited about it too. And that excitement is infectious, and it get folks to support the work that you all are doing,
This isn't exactly a question. This is a response to a question someone else had, just to let people know that there is a program for helping people do conservation at home through the University of Illinois Extension and the Cook County Forest Preserve districts. And there are workshops that are held to help people understand what they might be planting where, to bring back natives that will be supportive both for wildlife, for just the native flora and fauna. So Conservation at Home, you can look it up and find out more about it, and you can look at getting either your home or a certain area certified as Conservation at Home.
And yeah, just to add to that, the Cook County Forest Preserve is aggressively looking to restore the land back with native plantings. And if you're looking to volunteer, you can go onto their website and look for volunteer opportunities. They're looking to restore 30,000 acres, so I do that every weekend. So if you're interested in doing that, you can go to their website.
What sorts of issues do you run into with government regulations of medicinal plants specifically? Is this kind of gardening restricted?
I think with the exception of the city's ordinance on tall weeds in the backyard, but that's a thing of the past, at least in Chicago. Does anybody else have any?
I think also misinformation. At Trickster, it's a suburban garden, but it's an open space. There are no fences. It's open to the public. When we planted tobacco, we had some community members asking, well, is that legal? And then that person asked another person who asked another person, and then all of a sudden, next week, I don't know if you can plant that. I don't think that's legal. And it's just a misinformation of what can or cannot be planted or harvested.
And I think with the regulations too is just make sure what you have is not a protected plant under CITES, and there's no trafficking. So like you can't, if you're growing tobacco, you can't sell it. You can give it as a gift, but you can't sell it. So if you're not doing any of that, you're fine.
So we're going to take our last question now, and then you could come up front and talk to our speakers yourself if you like, and of course check out this amazing collection from Trickster.
Yes, my name is Sandy. I am Ojibwe from Bad River, northern Wisconsin. I'm also an herbalist, have been since I was real little, and Medewan with the Grand Medicine Society. Okay. I am wondering why all of this, when you're talking about ethnobotany and Native American and the medicine and the harvesting of plants, and nothing was brought up with about respecting the plant and making an offering and thanking it for giving its medicine for your well-being and for your health.
My apologies. I always often think that's kind of a given, and maybe you should have elaborated on that. At Trickster, before we plant, we ask first. We ask Mother Nature, can we plant these plants? Can we plant these seeds? We give offerings of tobacco. We burn sage prior to even planting the plants. And then with harvesting, we're very, very careful with the harvesting of the plants. Not only asking permission of our human relatives, but asking permission of our plant relatives. Can we harvest you? And we'd never harvest an entire plant. We always leave some behind. Those are some of the tenets that we use. And I think for us, maybe, if I could speak on all, it's just kind of a given. That's how we were brought up.
I did have to smile when you mentioned, I forget which one was mentioned it about the little girl who about the sunflower being watered. And she said, but I talked to the plant and it said it needed water. And that is the kind of respect that you have for the plants.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to our speakers.